And happy Veterans Day. My name is Ernest and I'm the author of Hearts Torn Asunder. I'm speaking to you guys from the beautiful Mitchell Mansion in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I wanted to talk about tonight on this Veterans Day about what war does to the mind, the body, and the memory of the American Civil War. So I hope you enjoy the book. It's available on Amazon, on anywhere booksellers, and I hope you find this a meaningful book to talk about Civil War soldiers and their experience. So thank you for joining us.
We welcome tonight Ernest, who has been a Civil War living historian for over 10 years and a veteran, having served in the U.S. Army, North Carolina National Guard in the artillery. Ernest has worked in several historic parks in both North and South Carolina, including the Bennett Place Historic Site, and he's currently serving as director of the City of Raleigh Museum and the Dr. M.T. Pope House Museum. He's the author of Hearts Torn Asunder, Trauma in the Civil War's final campaign in North Carolina. And he will be speaking to us tonight about the experiences of both soldiers and civilians caught in the chaotic last days of the war in that theater. And he has brought a supply of his books along, which he would be happy to sell and autograph for you after his talk. So, Ernest.
Well, thank you so very much. This is my first time to Milwaukee, my first time to Wisconsin, and the hospitality you have shown has warmed this Southerner's heart. So thank you so much for having me. It is an incredible opportunity. Everybody I've met on this trip has been so incredibly nice and just welcoming, so I hope to come back sometime soon and spend more time. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that came out last year. And I specifically chose November to come out and talk to y'all because it is Veterans Day. And a lot of this talk hopefully is going to provide a new aspect on how to view Civil War veterans. In fact, I may argue that it may be a new opportunity to view all veterans, despite what war they served in. This is kind of unlocking this key to understanding that veteran's experience. That, like Oliver Wendell Holmes said, is the incommunicable experience of war. So, it's not quite your average Civil War talk, but hopefully you'll find it, I can't say it's going to help you find it enjoyable because it is truly a depressing and sad topic to talk about, but it's going to be meaningful. And I look at this very end of the war, these last weeks of the war in North Carolina, which is largely forgotten, unexplored, as a way to sort of view this veteran's experience. And I often said, if you're going to get screwed on a talk, technology is where it's going to be happening. So if you just give me a second, I'll restart this. It's frozen. How many of you guys know where this is? A few of you. Now this kind of gets to the very heart of my talk. Why not many of you know where this is? And we should know where this is. What you're looking at is the site of the largest surrender of the American Civil War. In this small, modest farmhouse, 89,000 Confederate soldiers were surrendered. Why don't we know that? Why is this not part of our Civil War knowledge base? Why it is not known more popularly? The Civil War has more books published on it than the Bible, I think I heard this evening. This is the farm of James and Nancy Bennett in Durham. Now, this was the site of William Tecumseh Sherman accepted the surrender of General Joseph E. Johnston in April of 1865. Now, Johnston had the reconstituted Army of Tennessee, right around 26,000 to 30,000 Confederates. But he surrendered all those Confederates in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, which gave that total. Now, when I graduated from college, this was my first job as a newly minted Civil War historian. And I was so excited to talk to all these visitors from around the world that would come in and talk about Johnston and Sherman. But the number one question I got was not about the war, not about the generals, but where was the bathroom? And again, what struck me is we don't know about this story, this end of the war. Again, most of us think the war ended at Appomattox, and most people ask them, that's what they will say. But the war goes on, and it gets more complicated ending than we think. Reunification is talked about more than anything else in this surrender here in this house. Now, I really wanted to understand why the Bennett place and this war in the Carolinas was largely written out of our basic knowledge of the Civil War. And so I really started to figure out why, to ask that question, what causes this amnesia of us in the Civil War? Now, this monument, I think, really addresses that. And this is perhaps one of the most unique monuments you're going to see dealing with the Civil War anywhere in the United States. It is called the Unity Monument, with one column representing the North, one the South. The materials are gathered from across the nation. And the pediment across the top simply says Unity. Now, when this marker was proposed in the 1920s, it caused a lot of havoc. Now, Durham became a huge tobacco center in the post-Civil War South. All of these Union and Confederate soldiers who were hanging around Durham while these negotiations were going on were raiding those tobacco warehouses, and they got their hands on this specific type of tobacco, this bright leaf tobacco, which they loved. And after the war, would write back to Durham asking how they would get that bright leaf tobacco. And so that's how the Duke Empire, Duke University, named after it. So the magnates of the 1920s said, hey, our success is based on the boom of tobacco. We need to put something at the site where it all kind of started. So they proposed this monument. Now, when this got out in Durham, people's heads exploded. The United Daughters of the Confederacy said, oh no. We are not going to mark the site of what they called the surrender of one of Lee's armies. Those old United Confederate veterans did not want any part of it. And a lot of people in Durham were fairly apathetic, if not hostile, to this monument. Why? Why do we need to mark this? Why do we need to rechurn up those memories of a very painful war in which we lost? Strangely, no Union soldiers or Union groups participated or wanted this monument as well. So it really came to a head. But ultimately, it was unveiled. We just celebrated the 100th anniversary last month of the erection of the Unity Monument. But that gave me an idea that looking at the reaction of this monument and to churning up those memories of what these truly chaotic and just out of control anarchy days of the decomposition, the basic falling apart of the Confederate Army and the arrival of Union armies, what did that do? What memories did those painful memories did this monument begin to pick the scabs at? So we do see a couple of Confederate veterans who arrived to participate in the unveiling. And my favorite part of this picture is if you look, they're all asleep. They're all asleep in the background. So to kind of orient you on sort of this end of the war history that we really don't have, I'm going to catch you guys up on the scene. So this is pretty much central North Carolina right now. Raleigh's the state capital where I run the City of Raleigh Museum, and the Research Triangle, Chapel Hill, Raleigh, Durham is right there. You kind of see the North Carolina Railroad cutting across the breadbasket of the Piedmont. And it is here in April of '65 that the two armies arrived. The reconstituted Army of Tennessee that Joseph Johnston tried to pull together to stop. William Tecumseh Sherman marched through the South. He had marched to the sea, took Savannah, December of 1865, was headed to join Grant to try to pry Lee out of his Petersburg entrenchments. So he marches through the Carolinas, and he arrives in the city of Goldsboro and begins to make his move. But with the news of Grant prying Lee out of the entrenchments and sort of moving west, there's no longer a need for Sherman to go to Virginia. And he sets his goal on the one thing that stands between him and victory for the Union cause, and that is the destruction of the Army of Tennessee, Johnston's force. So on April 10th, he starts moving out of Goldsboro, and Johnston begins moving across central North Carolina. And they don't know when this campaign begins on April 10th, a day after Appomattox. He does not know of Lee's destruction. So he's moving west in hopes to try to figure out what to do. Now, of course, Sherman moves after him. And Sherman's major problem is if Johnston escapes, he's going to have to chase him back to the Deep South. And this war, this end of the war, would turn into a very ugly, prolonged guerrilla warfare that nobody wanted. Now, as they're moving across central North Carolina, the perfect storm arises. Where do all of those parolees go from Appomattox? They begin drifting down into central North Carolina, and they collide with Johnston's men. All of these hungry, traumatized men from campaigns from across every battlefield of the Civil War collide in central North Carolina. For those civilians who are caught in the middle, it's a horrific experience. And then close on their tail is Sherman's 89,000 Union soldiers. So this sets the scene for what's kind of going on these last days. Now, to kind of catch you up on how our story begins, we're going to talk about memory and how this experience of what's going on in North Carolina and the experience of these soldiers and civilians, how did what war did to their bodies and their minds shape the way that they remembered the war. And one of the things I want to talk about is this lady right here, Cornelia Phillips Spencer. And she's living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where the university is. And she saw the entire war from her front steps. She saw all of these university students go off to war in 1861. She saw the Confederacy, what was left of these tattered soldiers, march through the town. She saw her town occupied by Union cavalry in those last days and stay there while the negotiations were going on in Bennett Place. And once the war over, she feels compelled to write a book that she said in her own words would indict the victors for all of the crimes they committed on the Southern populace. And we see that here. This book she wrote, The Last 90 Days of the War, which is perhaps the very earliest history book of Sherman's march into North Carolina. Now, in her quest to write a truthful history, she ran into a problem. How was she going to talk about the Confederate demoralized soldiers that she saw and the strange and uncomfortable things that they did as she's trying to indict the Union soldiers on what they did? And she kind of gives herself a way out. And so this is a quote from her book. She says, "What our soldiers did or did not do in those last dark days of confusion and utter demoralization, we record with sad and tender allowance. Wrong was done in many instances and excesses committed, but we feel the remembrance of their high and noble qualities will in this end survive all of their temporary blots and blurs. And for those who perished in the wrongdoing engendered by desperation and failure and want, their cause has perished with them, so perished the memory of their faults." So what she's saying is that, yeah, the Confederacy was crushed and defeated. So all the bad things Confederate soldiers did in these last days as the army fell apart should be forgiven. Now, one of the problems that she ran across happens to come on the last days of the surrender of North Carolina's capital in Raleigh. And I start the book with this story because it's a very confusing story that I had to sort of tease out to sort of make some sense. And it begins April 13th, 1865, as Sherman's army is at the very gates of North Carolina's capital, one of the very few southern capitals left uncaptured. Two former North Carolina governors went out to sort of beg for quarter, beg Sherman to spare the capital, spare the university in Chapel Hill. So that morning, as Johnston's army is retreating, heading west out of Raleigh, these two governors wait to try to hand over the keys to the abandoned city in hopes there will be easy transference of power. And one of those governors, David Lowry Swain, he's standing on the southern steps of the Capitol looking down the main street in Raleigh, Fayetteville Street. Town is deserted. It's a drizzly rain that morning. The sounds of exploding Confederate munitions are echoing through the city. And as he's sitting there, waiting to turn over the keys, he has echoing in his mind the words of Sherman's cavalry commander, General Judson Kilpatrick. Now, before Swain returned to the city, Judson Kilpatrick, who is one of the most colorful Union generals of the entire Civil War, rides up to Swain and he says, "I am told that General Sherman has given your town quarter, and I will honor that. But if I meet any resistance, there will be hell to pay." Swain says, "No problem." But as Swain is sitting there waiting for Kilpatrick to arrive to hand over the keys, he sees a problem right into his vision. Immediately across from the Capitol, he sees a gaggle of Confederate cavalrymen. He calls them the debris of our army. And he watches these men. They tie up their horses and they begin looting a jewelry store right across from the Capitol. Now, Swain had just risked his life to broker this deal. And he says, "Oh, this is going to break the deal and the city's going to suffer." So he marches over to these men and a shouting match erupts. And finally, one of these Confederate troopers turns to Swain and says, "Damn Sherman and damn the town too. We care for neither." At the exact moment, looking down Fayetteville Street, they see the parade of Judson Kilpatrick coming up. Flags unfurled, playing Hail Columbia. Now, a lot of these gaggle of Confederate cavalrymen jump on their horses and ride out of town. But inexplicably, one mounts his horse and sits in the middle of the street and waits. And as Kilpatrick gets closer, this young cavalry trooper pulls out his pistol, begins firing it at Kilpatrick, yelling, "Hurrah for the Southern Confederacy!" puts his pistol back in his holster, and jets out of town. Now, unfortunately, the young trooper, the road he took, didn't go out of town. He hits a dead end. He whips his horse around, but it slides on the wet cobblestone and he falls. Now, before he can remount and escape, he's captured. Now, at this point, there's two versions of what I'm about to tell you. One version is Cornelia Phillips Spencer's version, and she says in her book that the young trooper was brought back to Kilpatrick. And Kilpatrick asked this man, "Why did you violate the truce?" The young man says, "I didn't know of any truce." Kilpatrick says, "Well, too bad." Turns to his staff officers and says, "Take this man out where none of the ladies can see him and hang him." But the young trooper begs for 5 minutes to right his wife, cruelly denied, and he is hung. That is her version. But there was an eyewitness there that morning that saw the whole thing, Millie Henry. Now, Millie Henry had been enslaved on a plantation in Yazoo City, Mississippi. And when the war got too close, she was brought back to Raleigh. And she was there that morning, and this is the state capitol, drawing water from a well. Now, in 1937, when the Works Progress Administration found her, she told a very different story that morning that had been burned into her memory for over 70 years. She said she remembered the trooper firing at the Union Army. She saw his escape, she saw his capture, and she remembers the conversation between the trooper and Kilpatrick. So, in her narrative, it is the only narrative that names this young man. Kilpatrick asked him his name. He said, "I am Robert Walsh of the 11th Texas Cavalry." "Why did you violate the truce?" And in her version, the trooper says, "Because I hate the Yankees and wish they were dead in a pile." "Take this man out where none of the ladies can see him and hang him." And in her version, this young man begins laughing. Laughing maniacally, saying, "Kind of you, sir, kind of you." And she said he laughed all the way till they strung him up. Very different stories. And this is what intrigued me. What's going on? What's going on with this young man? I think Cornelia Phillips Spencer is trying to polish this story a little bit. But Millie tells us that what we are seeing is a very traumatized young man at the very end of a war which they are about to lose. Now, to kind of give a little context to the story, you need to figure out what's going on with who is this Robert Walsh and what's up with the 11th Texas Cavalry. Now, saying that you hate the Yankees and wish they were dead in a pile was perhaps the very worst thing you could have said to Kilpatrick, because he had been finding his soldiers dead in a pile, executed largely by these men. These are guys from the 8th Texas Cavalry, sister unit Now, when historians start talking about medical science, it's on thin ice, but it's really important to understand what's going on. Now, in your brain, you've basically got two parts we're going to talk about. Your frontal lobe. Now, this is where language, reason, morals, all this higher thinking that we associate with being human takes place. This is sort of where our thinking, rational, moral brain happens. Now, when you encounter a threat, when you perceive fear, is it a tornado? Is it a mugger? Is it combat? Your body does this incredible gymnastics. In a split second, your mind goes, that's a threat. It sends a signal to your body to get ready. We have to deal with the threat. It's called the fight, flight, freeze, fawn reaction. You're either going to fight it, you're going to run from it, you're going to freeze up, or you're just going to lay down. So what your brain does is release this super powerful neurochemical cocktail. And what it does is it shifts all of your energy to your primal brain, that very middle of your brain that does everything you don't think about. It tells your lungs to breathe, your heart to beat, your stomach to digest. Everything you don't think about is controlled by the animal part of your brain. What the brain does, it shifts all the energy here. It says, primal brain, hey, get ready, make those muscles, get ready to run, heart speeds up, vision focuses. This is a survival mechanism we as humans have adapted. Now, what the problem happens is after this happens, usually our brain kind of cycles through these chemicals and gets rid of it. But what we see, especially in combat, day after day, going through this flip, people get stuck. They get stuck in this fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. Your heart is constantly going. You're constantly looking for the threat. That's where problems begin. And day after day of combat, like 10 months in combat, Petersburg, these long campaigns where we see the most damage done to soldiers. Now, no longer can soldiers play old soldier. Unfortunately, through our research from veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, we can see the damage that is done with this neurochemical awash in the brain. You see on the far left what a healthy brain looks like. One that is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. You can see you can literally see the changes that happen in the brain. TBI is sort of a new term that's come into our language, traumatic brain injury. Is it an improvised explosive device in Iraq? Is it football players? Or is it the cannonade at Gaines Farm or at Gettysburg? There's concussions causing these problems. And on the end, you see what the brain, there's poor souls who have both. So we can truly see the physical changes in the body that trauma does. It's fascinating. Now, this is sort of our modern symptoms of PTSD. These are some of the symptoms we've proven that soldiers today go through. Now, I encourage you to take a look at these and go back to the historic record. All of these diaries and letters we love so much. Go back and look for this stuff. And when I did it, I found it. It's all there, that these men and women are expressing this, and it's here. The flashbacks, the memories of something triggers them to go back to that moment of fear, avoiding places and thoughts. You're going to avoid stuff that triggers that memory. And one thing I found interesting, the emotional numbing. We always talk about hardened veterans, hardened soldiers, they're hardened. That's part of this PTSD, numbing to the emotions. And then we talk about not being able to concentrate, insomnia. Your body is always looking for the threat. You're stuck in this fight or flight or fawn or freeze. They're always constantly on edge. Now, when we talk about this end of the campaign in North Carolina, it's not a really bloody campaign. There's the Battle of Bentonville, Avisboro, and a lot of numerous skirmishes, but it's not the bloodbath of these major battles. But what I had to keep in mind as I looked at these soldiers who were arriving in North Carolina, that they brought the trauma with them from all parts of the battlefields, from Gettysburg, from Stones River to Chickamauga to Shiloh. this trauma travels with it in the bodies and minds of these soldiers. And I put this up here because the 32nd Indiana was here in North Carolina. And this incredibly powerful drawing by Adolf Metzner. And all of us had seen the Matthew Brady photographs and kind of desensitized it. But when I saw this, it just kind of reminded me of what these men had seen on battlefields across the United States. And it's a horrific picture of these two Confederates being playing cards in the Battle of Shiloh. And this cannonball came and basically took their heads off. And that's kind of what we have to think about as we follow these soldiers through the war and through the rest of their lives. And one of the ones I talk about is this guy, Colonel Newell Gleason. Gleason in the 87th Indiana won great praise from the Union Army by standing fast on Snodgrass Hill at the Battle of Chickamauga and defending and buying time for the Union Army to escape. Horrific losses, 49% losses of the regiment. Gleason gets great fame, but it takes a critical toll on his mental health. He travels with Sherman to Atlanta, and junior officers noticed him acting really weird. Gleason would pull them aside and confess to the plot he knew to remove him from command. They would see him sitting by the campfire at night, laughing maniacally one moment and crying the next. Now, telling is when the 87th Indiana entered South Carolina, the usual stern disciplinarian of Gleason reared up in the saddle and yelled out to his men in a loud voice not to leave a living thing alive in South Carolina. He couldn't escape the war. In 1886, Gleason decides to relieve himself of the demons that followed him home and threw himself down a flight of stairs and killed himself. Another soldier who traveled with Sherman is John A. Cundiff. And I talked about the Confederates executing all these Union foragers they had. Well, the Union Army decided to say, hey, it's going to be a tit-for-tat execution. So poor John Cundiff had the horrible responsibility on being a firing squad for some of these Confederate prisoners who were executed in retaliation. And this did something to him. Not only was he, again, wounded in the war, but when he went home, those ghosts followed him home. His family would notice that he wouldn't sleep in the house because he was afraid Confederate agents were after him. He would take his musket and blanket and go sleep in the woods. Finally, when he died, the newspaper article said that he hoped that he had finally found peace. A very common story on all these veterans. As you follow them through life, you'll see these problems they have. Now, I'm sure you all know there's a whole genre of Civil War dog literature, and Harvey is perhaps one of the most famous ones. And he is the dog of Daniel M. Stearns you see on the left. And Stearns had a little bit of humor about him because he made Harvey a collar, and the collar said, "I am D.M. Stearns' dog. Whose dog are you?" And Harvey followed Stearns everywhere. He was his constant companion. And as the fighting raged around Atlanta, Stearns began to suffer. He had been in the saddle for 48 hours straight. He'd come down with a horrible fever that put him out of action for a couple of days. When he returned to his regiment, thrown into the horrific fighting at the Battle of Utoy Creek. Now, Stearns didn't follow Sherman all the way around. He was sent north to stop Hood's invasion of Tennessee. And he was there at the Carter Cotton Gin and caught the full fury of Patrick Cleburne's attack at Franklin. But he did join Sherman in North Carolina, and he was there at the end. Now, it became quite clear when Stearns returned home that something was wrong with him. He decided not to spend any time with family or friends, but only wanted to spend time with Harvey. So Harvey became his support animal. He would talk about how he would walk and the ground would undulate in front of him. And he often complained he felt as if his head had an iron band around it constricting it. And at a moment of clarity, he said, "Those damn cannonballs did this." And his family couldn't put up with him for much longer because he was just impossible. And they put him into the North Cleveland Asylum, where he spent almost his last days and died in 1889. Harvey would go on to the regimental reunions, but without his master. Homer again. Defiance, inviting a shot before Petersburg. And I think what Homer is trying to show us here is this Confederate standing on the parapets, inviting a shot, that he's fed up with war and wants to be shot by Union sharpshooters rather than put up with the chaos and madness of war. It's, of course, a contrived scene. Homer would have never seen it, but just embodies what the Confederates, how the war followed them home. And the two I wanted to talk about are two North Carolinians, Thomas Clingman and William Holland Thomas. Now, before the Clingman was known as the Prince of Politicians from North Carolina, serving in the House and the Senate in the U.S. When war came, he went with the South, fought in many, many, many different battles across the Army of Northern Virginia. In the last days, wounded at the battles of Weldon Railroad, hobbles into Joseph Johnston's headquarters and stoically asks to lead a last-ditch, suicidal Confederate Thermopylae against Sherman's advancing army. Johnston stoically says, "Well, I'm not in the Thermopylae business," and denies his request. Now, Clingman kept the war at arm's distance for a long time, had a great post-war career. But it finally found him in his aging days, and he himself spent his last days in an asylum in North Carolina. Now, Holland Thomas did not have that luxury. Now, Thomas was known for raising a regiment of Cherokee Indians to fight for the South in the mountains of North Carolina. And they fought the really awful brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor fighting in the mountains of North Carolina, and saw some action in the Valley Campaign in 1864. Now, when he came home, the war got on him rather quickly. In 1867, his wife called friends and family and said, "Come and get him." After one night, he held an axe over her head and made her play their family piano. He was in and out of asylums for the rest of his life. So, he could not escape the war. And I think a lot of soldiers had some form of trauma and the way these nightmares followed them home. And this is a crazy story that I found, written by a fellow named William F. Allison of the 3rd Confederate Cavalry. And I feel that this story had just been on his consciousness because this appears in the very first Confederate magazine in 1893. And it's a story that he writes about walking away from the surrender. And he talks about walking and seeing these big patches of blood in the road. And he thought, it must be a horse injured. And he looks up the road and sees this scene about this guy sitting on a pile of railroad ties and all of these other soldiers sitting around talking to this fellow in a red and white paisley shirt. And as he walks up, he hears this conversation take place. He says, "There's no use in trying to do anything for me. I am dying, but you can take my coat to my wife. She is the wife of General Rains." And you don't get to see it, but as he's talking, Allison sees this guy take his hand and put it in his shirt and pulls out this bloody hand and wipes it over. And it's not a red and white paisley shirt. It's a white shirt covered in his own blood. And Allison believes that this is a self-inflicted wound that this guy has. And it's just this glimpse of these Confederates who are just falling apart psychologically as their cause and country falls apart with them. James E. Taylor, a great correspondent that traveled with Sherman. And into this mix, we have to talk about the civilians and their experience. What was it like being in the wake, in the path of these two warring armies? And you see sort of a conceptualized drawing that Taylor did of what it would be like when Sherman's bummers arrived at your house. To burn your house, to destroy your clothes, to kill every animal on your farm. Some of these stories are very heartbreaking, that they would leave these civilians without a morsel of food to eat. And like Samson J. Norris said, we have to gild them up and make them appear in a less repulsive form. Now, so many refugees are trying to escape these armies. And refugeeing is a pretty traumatic experience. To take everything you owned, throw it in a wagon, and try to escape with your lives, leaving friends, families, and fortunes behind. And when I talk about South Carolina truly being a really ugly war, this looms largest in that nightmare, the burning of Columbia. And for those people fleeing and sort of spreading about what was it like to be in the path of Sherman's army, this loomed large in the nightmares of many Southerners, especially those in North Carolina. And if you really want to talk about, to see the trauma of Union soldiers on full display, this is where they really slipped the bounds of military control and kind of basically went mad for a while. So Columbia is very interesting. Now, for those in the capital of North Carolina, this is what they felt was going to happen, and it caused great duress and anxiety. And we see that here. This is a plantation house that once stood in Raleigh called Will's Forest, and a home of the Devereaux family. Margaret Devereaux, her husband was the quartermaster general for all of North Carolina, and she was there that April day when Sherman's army arrived. And she writes that story. She's got an entire house of refugees which had fled the advancing Union army. Now, once the alarm is sounded, she jumps up and runs upstairs to warn everybody about the approaching army. And as she runs through the house, she looks out the window and sees her yard filling up with Union soldiers. She dashes upstairs and grabs her family, and they rush over to the window and they look down into the yard, and it's filling, all the men are looking up at them. And there's even a fellow climbing up the side of the house. Now, for these women who had heard these horrific stories about what they felt was about to happen to them, the ravaging they were about to get in their minds, Mrs. Kane turned to Devereaux and said, rather than face this imagination or what her friends and family and everything had built about Sherman's army, she said, we can always throw ourselves from the window. We can commit suicide rather than what they thought was about to happen. Now, Chapel Hill, a neighbor of Cornelius Phillips Spencer, Lucy Battle. Now, I know it's hard to believe by looking at the portrait of Lucy Battle that she was a woman who kept a firm grasp on her house. I wouldn't want to mess with Lucy Battle. She writes a letter, or her husband does, writes to their son in Raleigh between Chapel Hill. And the letter is very telling about her mental state at the time. And the letter goes that your mother, her husband writes to their son, your mother is in a frightful state. She is afraid that she will be unable to procure the medicine that she is accustomed to taking, and I fear that it will almost kill your mother. Any thoughts on what that medicine could be? It's probably laudanum. She had lost both of her sons in the fighting of the Northern Virginia, and I think it really broke her heart. And what better to fill that hole than opium, the narcotics, to numb themselves. And if you think about the wave of grief that swept over both North and South in the wave of the death, that we see that Americans, the first great opioid crisis in American history, looms large in the shadow of the American Civil War. And we begin to see the mental health crisis. This is Raleigh's Asylum, the North Carolina Insane Asylum that opened in 1856, with the very first patient being a veteran of the Mexican War. And we're able to get into the records now of the hospital, and it paints a horrible picture. We begin to see people enter the hospital during the war, but the floodgates open in the years afterward. And one of them is this poor chap who's got one of my most favorite first names I never tire of saying, Aristarchus Jenkins. A young Granville County, North Carolina, who went to go fight in the Army of Northern Virginia in the 15th North Carolina. His first year of service was pretty easy. But when he re-enlisted in July of 1862, his fortunes changed dramatically. His brother drowns in the first invasion of the North, and he was wounded at the Battle of Sharpsburg, wounded again in October, wounded the third time in 1864. They put him out of service for 60 days. And when he's put back in the Army the third time in February of 1865, he says, I've had enough. He deserts. He swallows the oath. Joins the Union cause. When he returns to North Carolina, he walks in, his family is so happy to see him, but when he tells them what he did, they shun him, turn their back on him. And I think that's what really did him in. Because in 1867, he walks through these doors of the asylum in North Carolina and never leaves. This is his grave on the asylum grounds, and you see the city of Raleigh looming in the background. Now, just today, I was able to go to the Milwaukee Historical Society and find the asylum records for Milwaukee. And they are a great collection of a document that testifies into the mental health of Union soldiers returning back to Milwaukee. These are the asylum records for people in North Carolina, in Raleigh. And you can see off to the left are the names, the dates they are admitted to the hospital, ages, the supposed causes, and how their trauma manifests. So this is the last record for December of 1864 and January of 1865. And if you go down the list, it's a very interesting collection because you can see it's ill health, epilepsy, fright, excessive use of opium, excessive use of narcotics. But the one that really struck me is if you look down, there's one thing that doctors simply identified as the cause of this mental problems was simply the war. The war. Now I want to quickly call you to the very last entry on here. It's for April 18th, 1865, a 45-year-old male who suffered for the war for the past month. Now what's interesting is Raleigh is captured by Union soldiers on April 13th. So this is the first patient admitted while Union soldiers are occupying the city. And it's very telling who he is. Can you guys read that? Isaac, African. So we don't think about how African Americans in this mix, as this war ends, what is their mental health doing? So this is the first black patient that is put into the state hospital by Union authorities. Oliver Otis Howard is behind this and personally goes to the hospital to make them treat this man. So what we see is this transition from slavery to freedom, it's kind of dangerous. We think it's pretty easy, but it's dangerous. As these black people go from being seen as a commodity to a liability, Confederate soldiers take out their anger on these men and women. We see them executed, beaten. So it is a very dangerous time, but what we see is that transformance from slavery to freedom. Their mental health improves as white Southerners dissipates or degrades. Now, amazingly, is this fellow who finds his way into the hospital. Eli Hill, a former slave who was from Onslow County, enlisted in the Union Army in August 1864 in the 37th United States Colored Troops. One of the very few black troops to go with Sherman from Goldsboro to Raleigh, was there at the end and saw it all. From 1865, he stays in the Army for a couple of years to 1868, but he's back in Raleigh in 1871 as a patient in the hospital. And he is put in there for a cause that is not attributed to white patients. He is put in there for what they called self-pollution. So I'm still trying to figure that out. Now, one of the things that really struck me about this is that to try to understand the experience of these men and women in the Civil War, we have to follow them through the rest of their life. And I was pretty shocked when I started to go through the newspapers, and we see the war, but it manifests itself in these different articles. We see veterans recognizing that other veterans are suffering. They're going into these soldier homes. They're having problems with their wartime service. The United States government is putting these national asylums together to try to take care of the soldiers who suffered. And then papers north and south have these horrible articles about veterans either killing themselves or killing their families. And this is really what struck me, that many of them could not keep their war at could not control it. It controlled them. And I always want to end my talk on this, another Homer. And this one I think is so profound. A veteran in a new field. And it talks about what I think Homer is trying to say is these men walked off the battlefield and tried to walk back into those farm fields they left in 1861 to find some normalcy, to try to deal with those ghosts that came home with them from the battlefield. How were they going to continue on? How were they going to unify as a nation? And I think at the end they had to put a lot away, a lot of stuff, a lot of emotions, a lot of memories in order to go forward and to sort of continue living in a nation that was reunited, went to the crucible of war, and those people suffered. The nation suffered. And it was their goal to try to come back and put their lives back together. And that is my talk this evening. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes, sir.
You think among the many desertions, a lot of them were psychiatric casualties?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Were many deserters psychological casualties? That's a good question. I don't know. I think a lot of people handled the stress in a lot of different ways. So I think probably a large proportion, like many other wars, just couldn't handle that stress. And they decided either they're going to crack or they're going to try to self-medicate by self-abolition from the army. So it's a great question, but no way of telling. Yes, sir.
Okay, you went to the soldiers' home day out there, it's a Milwaukee Medical Center, and then when we were doing research years ago, we found a lot of the veterans there were alcoholics. And that was one of the symptoms or results of coming back home, and they drank. Maybe they were drinking before the war, I don't know. But it seems that was a real hard situation to keep these guys in line.
Yeah, so alcoholism, again, right beside the excessive use of opium, narcotics, alcoholism, I see it in veterans of World War II, Vietnam veterans. It is a way that self-medicating through something that takes away, that clouds the mind, it kind of goes hand in hand with people trying to deal with that experience. So yeah, alcoholism just goes off the scale in the years after the Civil War. And I think after most wars, that is the case. Yes, sir.
Did you find anything where children who had lost a parent were writing or saw a parent either hung or killed?
Yeah, and so one of the things I took out of the book, because I was really on thin ice, is this concept of what we call epigenetics. So epigenetics is a very new field where how is trauma passed along to children? How is that experience passed along? And there is science to prove that the change in your genomes take place because of this neurochemical cocktail. Your body changes. And so there's a great study going on where they're looking at pension records of Union soldiers, and they're looking at Union soldiers to see how this trauma is passed on. And we're starting to see the manifestations of men who were prisoners, who were wounded, how young you were in combat, deeply affected how your children turned out. So we do see a lot of people who witness traumatic, like hangings, executions. That trauma proved to be difficult for them, but also passed that on to their children. So.
Way in the back.
Yes, sir.
We have the band of brothers from World War II, and I think that expands to the Civil War men who joined together afterwards and belonged to the GAR. There were just hundreds of those all over the country.
Yeah, I think we underestimate how critical these organizations like the GAR, the United Confederate Veterans, the American Legion, Veteran of Foreign Wars, these organizations serve a bigger purpose rather than just being a boys' club. It is organizations where men could get together and talk with other men who had the same experiences. Because what we see with a lot of veterans, talking to civilians who have no idea what that war experience was like, they just cannot understand. It's like the incommunicable experience. They cannot communicate that experience of war. So yeah, the GAR, from after working on this, showed me that these have a much more valuable safety network for veterans to have some people to talk to lean on, to be with, that I don't think a lot of veterans coming back today have these organizations. So that's why we see a lot of veterans today suffering much more than those men of World War II, Civil War, even Vietnam, you see them start to go away. So yeah, the GAR is a fascinating organization that is a big help.
Now, you said you were artillery yourself, 105s or 155s?
We started out at 8-inch. We moved to 155s, and then we went to the multi-launch rocket system.
It's so ironic that I watch all three channels, CNN, NBC, and Fox News. One of the channels within the last 3-4 days, exactly what your presentation is, something I never thought about. During the Civil War, of course, you were probably in the middle of the action, but nowadays you might be 15, 20 miles away. But they were pointing out these soldiers from Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Ukraine using our 155s, the health problems that they're now developing with the air pressure and the effect on the brain and on the organs, and how, as you're saying, they're coming back with post-syndrome, even though they've never been shot at or mortared. And so it's ironic, I watched this program and you brought up the same thing. It's a new field of our military engagement I never thought about before, the pressure being in artillery.
Yeah, my wife read that story to me, and I was fascinated that we forget, when we read about soldiers being in bombardments and the concussion, we don't think about the science that happens behind the bodies. We kind of take their accounts at face value, but there's a lot of medical science to take into effect. So yeah, that was a fabulous story. And what was the saddest part of that story is that since they were in a secret mission, the military did not award them the benefits for the post-traumatic stress disorder that they deserved because they were not supposed to be there. So a really sad case for the VA to let those guys down.
Excuse me. Well, Ernest, on behalf of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee, I want to present you the Certificate of Honor by order of the General Staff of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. This award is presented to Ernest Dollar for furthering our understanding of the causes and consequences of the American Civil War, the watershed event in our nation's history.
Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Don't run too far.
Don't run too far. There's a little bit more. In the years after the war, the Iron Brigade Association, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan units formed their association of the veterans. In the 1880s, they admitted children and ultimately grandchildren. In 1992, surviving sons of veterans gave custodianship of the Iron Brigade Association to the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. So as a representative of the association, it is my great honor to present to you a lapel pin signifying membership in the association. To Ernest Dollar.
Thank you guys so much.
I'm also going to steal the microphone here for a couple of seconds, maybe even longer. You know how I talk. On this past Monday, there was a program on PBS regarding the Veterans Home at the Milwaukee at Wood and Save the Soldiers Home and how much of that came about. Very interesting, very informative program. I understand it is supposed to re-air on PBS tomorrow night. And then we'll move to, I'm sorry.
Passport.
Passport, thank you so very much.
Passport already.
Is it on Passport already? Okay, so you have plenty of opportunities to see it. Features several of our roundtable members who were integral in the Save the Soldiers Home movement and what they have done, and in hopes what they continue to do. So well worthwhile. Go view it if you have the chance.
Remember, he has books for sale.
Absolutely.
That concludes the program for this evening. Remind you that our next program is on December 7th at the Country Club. So don't show up here. So I'm going to look for a minute. Okay. Thank you.